years, one of the worst cost of living crises we've had for a very, very long time. And that therefore we took the decision that we wouldn't hit them in the pay packet. And so there would be no more income tax, national insurance or VAT for working
But we're landing three big changes at the same time. I think that's what's causing the House of pain.
Yep, so then obviously that leaves you very few places to go for tax rises. Nobody wants tax rises. We didn't want to impose this tax rise. I didn't want to inherit the circumstances we inherited, but we did. And I felt it was better for us to fix the foundations in this budget in one go, so we did. So far as the impact on businesses concerned, obviously we've alleviated that with support for small businesses in particular, and creating the conditions for growth which will be good for all businesses. But the political landscape was pretty bleak and we had to put the investment in. And that has allowed us to invest in, amongst other things, the health service, which of course will help us get back people into work. We've got a lot of people out of work on long-term sick.
I think what business is really asking for now is a plan for growth, and they're struggling to see that. I appreciate the long-term virtues of the investment plan that the Chancellor has set out. The challenge is that it's all quite long-term, and in the long term we're all dead, and actually what is needed for the business community is help to grow now.
Yeah, I mean, what they've said to us, because the small business, in particular, business committee are really hugely important to this. We've been talking to them a lot. What they've said to us, small businesses in particular, is late payments are causing us a huge amount of problems. Therefore, we've put in place a strategy to deal with late payments. Getting loans out of banks is a real problem, so we've got that within our strategy, 250 million. Growth hubs where they can work with other businesses in their locality, so that's in our strategy. And then other work on management, innovation and exports is where they want, this reflects back to them, if you like, the support that they said they needed. And so that strategy is all there. And it's been very broadly welcomed. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Caroline Dining. You say the landscape's bleak, but it hasn't been for our world-leading creative industries. They've been growing at twice the rate of the rest of the economy, and I know that they're a very key part of your government's growth story, and yet AI companies have scraped the internet of books, of films, of music, all created by others without permission. It's effectively the largest heist of copyright in the world's history. And yet you've released a consultation which effectively gives big tech an exemption from the law, haven't you? Why?
Firstly, you're right to say there's a lot of optimism in the in the art and creative sector, and rightly so. We punch well above our weight in the world. AI is going to be, on the one hand, in my view, transformative for the better in art and culture and across industry and government and the delivery of public services. I think it's going to be a huge change over not 10 years but 5. Obviously, when it comes to the creatives, there is an issue over things like copyright, as you know. I think you were looking at this in your committee, and getting the balance right between the potential of AI and the protection of copyright. So we've actually just put a consultation out on this as to whether individuals should opt out or opt in. We think the proposal we're consulting on is the right proposal, but obviously it's out to consultation, and we'll consider the consultation at the end of that exercise.
The starting point, Prime Minister, of your consultation is a carve-out for AI developers to be able to use content without permission or payment unless creators essentially opt out and then essentially opt back in to their own copyright. It's in, out, in, out. It's like the hokey-cokey of policy making. And you talk about the optimism in the creative industries. At the moment, all I'm hearing universally across the creative industries is fear about this. So how are you going to balance the opportunities of AI that you talk about while addressing these fears?
Well, we think that is the right balance, but there are different views. I accept that, and that's why it's out for consultation, so we can take that into account as we go through the consultation. You know, there is a huge potential for AI, and obviously at the same time we've got to protect issues like copyright. So that's the balance we're trying to get right. We think we've got it in about the right place, but rather than just plough on with it, we're obviously doing consultation, and we'll carefully consider the responses to that consultation.
But the starting point isn't right. It's very much a starting point that's very heavily skewed towards the tech industry. You're proposing to take rights away and force creatives to opt back in to their own copyright. It's a bit like saying a burglar can nick all your stuff, and then that's all fine as long as you've got a sign up saying that's not okay.
No, I don't see it like that. I think it's a question of how you get the balance right. There are some advocates of opt-in, some advocates of opt-out. We've put a proposal on the table, and we're consulting on it. And obviously, when that consultation is over, we'll have a look at the responses that we've got.
Okay, so yesterday the Minister for Creative Industries told the House that the government's proposals were untested anywhere in the world and that we'll only progress them if there's a solution that meets all of the government's aims. So are you saying that once this consultation's over, if there's a solution that works for tech industries but not for the creative industries, you won't go ahead?
Well, no, we want to get the balance right, and there will always be disparate voices here. It's very unlikely we're going to get everybody saying the same thing and agreeing on the same proposition. We're at the cutting edge of AI. We're one of the leading countries in the world. We're in the top 3. We're in a massively advantageous position, and we should take advantage of that, in my view. We need to get the balance right, but we'll go through the consultation. At the end of the consultation, will there still be different views? Of course there will be, and arguments as to where the balance should be. But we put our proposal on the table. We're consulting about it, and we'll consider the responses.
But effectively, what you're doing is gambling a world-class British success story. You know, the creative industries are worth £125 billion to our economy. They fly our flag around the world, and you're gambling them in favour of companies who are already so rich that your own Secretary of State said we need to treat them like nation states. Why should these overseas tech giants effectively get a free subsidy on the back of British creators?
I don't think they should. I think we need to get the balance right. But I also think that we have a huge opportunity. We are one of the top 3 in the world in AI at the very point where AI is going to be transformative. And that puts us in a really good position against our competitors around the world. I don't want us to lose that edge. I think AI is going to transform not just the delivery of public service, not just productivity within our economy, not just the way we deliver in government. It's going to change the lives of people throughout the country in ways we can barely imagine at the moment. And I want us to take advantage of that. I do think it is a question of posture. I accept that. The one posture can be we see this as a huge opportunity that we should take advantage of as a country. Another posture is that it's a great danger that we should sort of heavily regulate ourselves against any impact. I'm in the first camp on this. We need to get it right when it comes to the creatives, of course we do. That's why we've put it out for consultation. But I'm in the camp that says this is a huge opportunity.
It sounds to me like you're in the camp that says you prefer the big tech foreign companies over the British creative industries. But let me ask you something else. You announced members of your Industrial Strategy Council last week, all very impressive, but not one executive representative from a commercial businesses in the creative industries there either. The board's chaired by a representative of Microsoft. So let me give you another chance to convince the creative industries that they are on an equal footing with others in your priority sectors for growth, and not just the stardust that you sprinkle in number 10 when you want to impress the world.
No, they're really important, and I've had the opportunity to have them in myself, not just through the department, directly to me to discuss with them. I think they punch well above their weight. I think we're fantastic on the creatives. It makes a huge impact on our economy. It's got soft power to die for. In almost every area of the creatives, we are brilliant as a country, and I think it's really important we support them to the hilt. And that's why I've had them in, that's why I've told them that, and we've talked through what would help them go even further. But they have my absolute full backing. I think they do a brilliant job. I think they've been the unsung heroes of our economy for far too long.
I think they're going to want more
whether it's music, art, culture, dance, you name it, we punch above our weight in the world, and that's a massive benefit for our economy.
I think they'll want more than your words, Prime Minister. I think they'll want to be seen that they're valued as much as the AI industry.
Liam Burnham, please.
Well, just amongst the perils that we'll face next year is obviously now the looming threat of tariffs. So what are you going to do to dissuade President-elect Trump from imposing tariffs on the UK?
Well, I'm not going to speculate as to what he is going to do. It won't come as any surprise to you that I'm not a fan of tariffs, and therefore we have to make sure that we avoid tariffs. We've got very good trade with the US, as we've got very good trade with other countries around the world. I want to improve on that, and as you will know, I had a meeting with President Trump in September in New York. I've had a number of
Did
phone
you discuss
calls
this?
Since, and including one yesterday. I won't go into the details of what we discussed, but am I alive to the danger of tariffs? Yes, of course. I'm against tariffs, but I'm not going to speculate as to what the incoming president might do.
You are committed to introducing or negotiating an SPS, a closer veterinary deal with the EU. That would probably rule out a grand bargain free trade deal with the United States, because we couldn't include something on agriculture in such a bargain. How are you going to put the two deals together, with Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other?
Well, I think that we can pursue both. I don't accept the argument that you've got to either be with the US or be with the EU. That isn't how it works at the moment with our current trade. We do want a closer relationship with the EU on security, on defence, on energy, and yes, on trade. And I've set out how we want to reset on a number of occasions. At the same time, I want to improve our trading relationships with the US. Is that going to be easy? Of course it's not. Do I think we can make progress? Yes, I do. That's among the reasons that I'm making sure we've got a good relationship with the incoming president, and that the relationship between our two countries remains as strong in the future as it has been in the past.
Thank you very much. Florence Eshelani, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. We are in a housing crisis, and so I'd be grateful if you could explain to the committee why you took the decision to freeze the local housing allowance rate this year.
Well, we are in housing crisis, you're absolutely right. The way out of that crisis is actually to ensure that we've got a sufficient number of homes, roofs over people's heads in all the areas that are needed, which is one of the major drivers of the housing crisis that we're in, and that's why we've been clear in our ambition to build homes, 1.5 million homes over the period of this Parliament, and within that to make sure that there's a significant number of affordable homes. So that's, I completely accept the definition of a housing crisis. We need to make sure that we have the wherewithal to get out of that crisis.
Just on that, you've talked about homes. In less than a week, most of us in this room will be able to spend Christmas with our loved ones in a warm, safe home. But yet 160,000 children are going to wake up on Christmas Day in temporary accommodation. And there was a feature on the BBC News last night, in News at 10, which showed the reality of people paying thousands of pounds for temporary accommodation, which was frankly overflowed with sewage. This is the reality people are facing, Prime Minister. And most of them are only in this situation because they lost the safety net of the LHA freeze. And the ONS data yesterday showed that average rent rises is going up by 9.3% in the private rented sector. Prime Minister, do you really understand the impact of freezing and making this decision?
Yes, and can I just take the numbers you quote to me on homelessness or temporary accommodation are appalling. That is what we've inherited, and you will have seen that just in the last week or two, the Deputy Prime Minister's set out the further money we're putting into dealing with homelessness and temporary accommodation, and the money that she's putting into local councils, and the initiatives that we are supporting. The Mayor of Manchester, for example, has been bearing down on homelessness, as you know. We want to build on that around the country, and that's why we put that money aside. But yeah, it's a terrible inheritance.
But
it's record numbers.
Yeah, but Prime Minister, do you understand that the additional funding to address homelessness is effectively redundant if you're not dealing with the root cause of why people have been forced into temporary accommodation, including freezing the LHA allowance?
Well, we've got to put the money in to support them in the homelessness and the temporary accommodation, and that is what we're doing. And these figures have been very high for a long time. We've inherited them, and we need to turn them around.
We are very grateful and we welcome the government's ambition in terms of new homes, but these figures that you've quoted, that 1.5 million, they have to be deliverable. You may be aware, Prime Minister, that new dwellings dropped this year, and the number of planning permissions, again, the number of planning permissions granted also fell by 15%. So earlier on you talked about planning reform, you talked about regulation, additional powers for councils. This is only part of the jigsaw in building that. There is a big lag across the supply chain. We don't have the raw materials, we don't have the skilled workforce. So in light of this, and coming back to your ambition and the government's ambition, do you think you're going to hit this 1.5 million target over the course of this Parliament?
Yes, that's why I set it out. I accept it's difficult, I accept it's stretching, but it's hugely important. A home is a base camp for the aspirations and opportunities of all individuals and all families, a safe and secure roof over their head. Amongst the reasons, you're quite right about the numbers this year of houses that haven't been built because the targets were put up and then they were taken down. We've put the targets back up and made them mandatory. We've been really clear that this has to be locally led so that it's for those within the locality to decide how they're going to comply with the targets, and if they can do so, then all well and good, no need for any intervention from government. If they can't, then we will intervene and push forward. We've been really clear that if it's a brownfield site, then it's a yes by default on planning. That's something that hasn't been there before. And we're also equally clear that we'll make use of the grey belt where it's necessary to do so. That's disused car parks, petrol stations, etc. But we intend to, and the planning reforms, obviously you'll have seen the consultation ended and the framework was issued just a few days ago. These are all the ingredients, in my view, that have been missing and why we haven't been building homes. 1.5 million is ambitious. It hasn't been done for decades. It's desperately needed. You know, and I also know we've got to punch through this because everybody says to me, government needs priorities. Of course it does. As soon as we put priorities up, then everyone says, well, what have you left out? It's unachievable. I don't accept that. I think this is an achievable target, difficult though it is, and we're determined to achieve it.
And again, we commend that, we welcome that, but do you think it's right then that the government haven't set targets in terms of how many homes they'll deliver a year? They haven't set out what tenure those homes will be, but yet you're asking local councils to report back on their targets. Another thing that's coming up, which we've looked at in our committee, is the fact that the skill force and the sector are not able to cope with helping the government build that. Again, coming back to my question, do you really think you can hit that target?
Yes, I do. And just on the targets, the way in which we've done it is to say, here's the mandatory target for each area. We want each area to decide for itself how it's going to meet those targets. What's the mix that they want? Where do they want it? It needs to be locally driven. And so at the first instance, we want that to be the way in which it gets delivered. But what we're not going to tolerate is where that doesn't happen and there isn't a plan put forward to meet the targets, that we're going to leave it as nothing happens. And at that point, the government will intervene. So that's why we're not, as it were, saying in each and every area, you must have this number of houses on that point there, because we don't want to do it in that way. We want it to be local plans. But we're being equally clear that if we don't get the local plans that meet the targets, then yes, there will be levers that we will pull centrally to make sure that that housing is delivered. Yes, of course, that means we've got to work on the supply chains. Yes, of course, it means we've got to have the skills in place. But that's why you need a priority. That's why you need a sense of driving mission to bring this together. And amongst my jobs is to chair the stock takes of the work we're doing, to get the various players around a room like this, to make sure we've got the skills, the supply chains, the numbers, the targets, with an assessment of where we are on the data. And that's the way we'll drive through this. But I'm not going to be a defeatist on this and say it's impossible to get the supply chains. I don't accept that. I'll be defeatist and say we're never going to get the skills. I don't accept that. Do I accept it's a stretch? Do I accept it's ambitious? Yes, I do. But we're determined to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up, Prime Minister, because in response to Ms Ashalomi, when she was talking about not lifting the local housing allowance so that people can afford a home of their own, you said, and I may slightly misspeak with quoting you, you said something along the lines of, we are putting money in to support people in temporary accommodation. that leaves an impression that you're supporting people in temporary accommodation over supporting people into permanent homes. I just wondered if that's what you meant to say, or if you'd like to clarify that point.
No, we're doing both.
Okay, so you're going to lift the local housing allowance, the LHA?
No.
That's what I didn't think you'd
I'll
said
give you
that.
the details of the money that we laid out just a few days ago.
Yeah, we know about the money for temporary accommodation, but it was the local. Perhaps Ms. Ashton, let me just give it one more.
Essentially, the additional funding that councils have received is going to be absorbed because rents are going up higher, and this is forcing families up and down the country into temporary accommodation for much longer. Yeah. We shouldn't be calling it temporary accommodation, Prime Minister. People are there for 14, 15 years.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that. And that is because, or amongst the reasons for that, and the drivers for that, are because the average age for owning your own home now is over 35 years old. And so many people...
So these are people who will never own their own home, that people have to rent because they can't afford to.
Hear me out on the rents have gone through the roof.
Yeah.
Because the competition for rented accommodation is through the roof. It's through the roof because we haven't been building enough houses, and therefore too many people want the same accommodation. It means the landlords are put in a prime position.
Yeah, we know all that. So yes, but what about the local? So you're ruling out completely lifting the LHA because that would help some people get their own homes rather than the temporary accommodation that Mr. Shalom said.
All of that has been set out in the budget, and we're not unpicking the budget.
Okay, thank you very much. Toby Perkins, MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. Prime Minister, you've been clear that you will back the builders, not the blockers. We know who the builders are, I think. So who are the blockers?
Well, those that say we shouldn't have targets for housing, those that say we should build here, those that have stood in the way for years.
I'm a bit more specific. I mean, who are these people that are doing this?
Well,
are we talking about planning committees, local councillors? Are we talking about local residents groups? Who are these blockers?
Well, all of the above. I was at a housing development in the course of the elections up in York Outer, looking at some housing that had been put up, and it was 20 years from the plan going in before the houses I was looking at were being built, and it was going to be 25 years before that housing estate was completed. That is never going to be enough to get growth in this country. Equally, I was inquiring about onshore wind farms and how long it would take to get one up, and I was told by someone that I thought was totally credible that you could build a wind farm in 2 years. I said, good, because we want clean power by 2030. He then said, well, we won't have that because it'll take 13 years before we get power. I said, well, talk me through that. He said, I'll lose 5 years to planning because somebody will object and I'll be in court for 5 years. I said, well, that needs fixing, but that only gets me to 7 years. I said, what about the other 6 years that takes you to 13? He said, well, the grid that needs to connect me won't begin to crawl towards me until I've got power coming out of my wind power, and then it's going to take 6 years for the grid to get to me. So 13 years for a 2-year project, that's the blockers. And it's no wonder that we're not going to get anywhere unless we get that out of the way. The other example, just etched on my brain, Scunthorpe Steel. I went up to the steelworks at Scunthorpe. They've got an electric arc furnace they think will be ready by 2029. The grid is going to connect them in 2034. We can't go on like that if we want to grow our... Well, exactly, that's why we want to get rid of the planning regulations.
Mr. Perkins was asking about...
That's why we want to change the regulations. We want to get our hands on the grid, because if we don't do those, we'll be stuck with these blockers for a very, very long time.
Mr. Perkins.
Okay, so in terms of the infrastructure, I mean, that's your responsibility. In terms of those people like councillors, local communities, that's obviously a key area. Britain's already one of the most nature-depleted nations on earth. Do you think that the current protections for nature in our planning system are excessive?
I think we could get the balance better. I do think we should obviously take measures to protect our environment, to protect nature, of course I do. But I think that we could do it differently. And so one of the proposals, as you know, that we're working on is the question of whether that balance should be struck on each and every application and project, one by one, case by case, or whether it can better be lifted so that you could look at the balance over a wider area, which I think would make a lot more sense.
So the question there would be who pays for that. If it's not the developer, we currently have biodiversity net gain, so on a case-by-case basis they have to replace the nature that they build over. If it's not them, who pays?
I think the developer should pay. into a fund that could be used to get that balance right. So I'm not saying they should be exempted from paying in. What I am saying is if you do it on a case-by-case basis, you can get quite a lot of results which slow things down, don't seem on the face of it to make a lot of sense.
So
that doesn't mean that we shouldn't protect nature and the environment.
Okay,
but I think
on that, the National Planning Policy Framework lists 3 objectives: economic, social and environmental. Is it the case that that order is not accidental, that you see that it being the priorities for you, economic, then social, then environmental, or are they 3 sort of equally important issues?
I think they're equally important, but I do think that for far too long we've had projects held up for problems that, whether it's, there are plenty of examples of newts and bats, you name it, or environmental issues, where if we'd looked at it in a slightly more strategic way, I think we could have got through the problem more quickly and more easily. It's not to downgrade the importance of the environment or nature, but I do think we can look at it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone listening to your speeches will hear a lot more on the growth than they'll hear on the nature protection. You mentioned there, as you've mentioned previously, about bat tunnels. We have the Deputy Prime Minister saying newts are getting in the way of people. What do you think planning officers who are looking at applications, what's the message you want them to hear from this government in terms of nature?
Well, it's important, but we want to build, we want to grow. If there's one inhibitor of our country over the last 14 years, it's been the failure of growth. And we intend to turn that around. And we can't turn it around without changing things. What I've done in years in opposition is ask myself, why have we had low growth in this country for 14 years? And I've walked through, I don't know how many examples with people who know what they're talking about. Having then worked out what's wrong, I intend to put it right. And therefore, yes, we put the emphasis on growth and on the economy. We've been through the worst cost of living crisis since I don't know when. And we were elected in to change that. To change that, we've got to unpick the problems that have caused the low growth in the first place.
And you're committed to a brownfield first policy.
Yeah.
What do you understand to be the reasons why we're not getting brownfield sites outside of London, areas like Chesterfield that I represent? Why do you think we don't get developments on those sites?
Because one, the targets were taken down by the last government and therefore there was no driving through. Secondly, there's a lot of buying up of land and waiting until it's worth more money and therefore not developed.
Are you doing anything about that?
Well, by pushing through on the proposals that we've got in place, then yes, we do want to do something about that. But equally, by having we are saying to each area, you've got to fulfil these targets, brownfield first, and if you do, get on with it, you'll have our backing and our support, and if you don't, we'll step in and do it for you. So that is already putting some momentum into the system.
Thank you, Mr. Alistair Carmichael, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. As Mr Burns said earlier, in the long run we're all dead, so that tees me up rather nicely for a few questions about inheritance tax, and in particular the changes to agricultural property relief and business property relief announced by the Chancellor in the budget. Prime Minister, who were the targets for these changes? Was it the super rich sheltering wealth? Was it the family farmers, or was it both?
The purpose was to raise revenue in the budget, so it wasn't aimed at a particular group of individuals. Without going over it again, we inherited a really bad situation. We took the clear view that we couldn't hit the pay packets of working people, but we needed to raise revenue because without raising revenue we couldn't have done what we're doing, for example, on the NHS, massive injection into the NHS, much needed. So the driving purpose, if you like, was to raise the necessary revenue from a number of different places, including this, but it wasn't targeted at this group or that group. What we tried to do with the regime we put in place was to protect the family farm in putting in a high threshold for inheritance tax for farms, which means that if you take the figures on the estates for farms, the vast majority of them are unaffected by the changes we put in place. But we weren't aiming at a particular group.
Okay, so it was a revenue-raising measure primarily. Does that mean that the government no longer adheres to the original purpose of these reliefs, which was to ensure the succession of family farm from generation to generation?
Well, no, we wanted to raise the revenue necessary, but also to recognise that family farms need to be protected, which is why instead of taking the view which that this should all simply be the rules, as it were, that are applied to other inheritance, that there would be still special rules within it with the thresholds that we put in place. And of course, the fact that even when the threshold triggers the payment of tax, that tax is paid at 50% the rate that other people would pay, and it's over a 10-year period interest-free. That's not available elsewhere, and so that's the fair balance between raising the revenue and the protection we wanted to put in place.
When it comes then to super rich people sheltering their wealth by buying land, that's still going to be quite an attractive option, isn't it?
Well, we weren't aiming at a particular group.
You don't think you're comfortable with the super rich sheltering their wealth by buying land?
Well, what we tried to do was get the balance right and to protect the family farm. Look, what the very wealthy do with their money within the rules is a matter for them. But what we wanted to do was to raise the revenue necessary because, we had to not only balance the books in the budget, we had to make important investments in things like health services in schools. That meant we had to raise revenue, and that's why we did this amongst other measures. But at the same time, we wanted to put in thresholds that ensures in the average case, the vast majority of family farms, could be passed on without being affected by the inheritance tax. That was the scheme and the purpose of it.
So how many family farms do you think are going to be caught by this?
Well, we've been through the figures on this, and just to rattle through...
I can help you here. HMRC say that there were about 500 claims for agricultural property relief.
Yeah. So
is that a robust figure for those who will be caught?
That is a robust figure. It's published by the Treasury, certified by the OBR. Currently, as I think you know, 73% of APR claims are less than £1 million, and 40% of APR goes to the 7% wealthiest claimants, and therefore I'm confident that this gets the balance right between raising the revenue that we needed to, but also protecting most of the estates.
The changes apply not just to agricultural property relief, they also apply to business property relief, do they not?
Yes.
Now, in practice, the figure that you've given us, 500 estates there, does not include estates where the land would have been passed on using business property relief, does it?
Well, I think that it does. I'll certainly go away.
No, I can assure you that it doesn't.
Well, the figure of 73% of APR claims are less than £1 million is a figure both from the Treasury and certified by the OBR. And I'm confident
as those who have had agricultural property relief. You can certainly come back to it.
Yeah.
If you are satisfied, Prime Minister, that 500 figure is not as robust as it may appear, and a lot of people have changed their mind on that in recent weeks, would you persuade the Chancellor to meet with the farming unions, because she has refused to do that thus far?
Well, I met, as you probably know, with the NFU President just a few weeks ago. Met actually previously on a number of occasions with his predecessor, and there's no issue with meeting. Of course there isn't.
Well, but for the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Well, that'll be a matter for her, but there's no in principle. I mean, I myself met the President of the NFU, and I think that...
Well, is it an example that you will be encouraging the Chancellor to follow?
Well, the Chancellor will manage her own diary, but I mean, I took the view...
Well, I mean, we're laughing here, but, you know, we had one witness giving evidence to the Select Committee who, when talking about the impact on his farming business, broke down.
Yep.
So there are a lot of people who don't find this funny. How does it make you feel to hear that witnesses were breaking down before my Select Committee?
Well, of course nobody's comfortable with that, but that is why I took the decision to have a meeting with the president of the NFU, to invite him in for a meeting with me, not with a great fanfare, but just for a private meeting so that I could hear for myself first-hand from him as to the points that he wanted to make understandably.
With a view to making changes?
I'm sorry?
With a view to making changes?
Well, no, we've got the policy, we've set out the policy, and I was clear about that, but did I want to hear what he had to say in a respectful way? Yes, of course I did.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carmichael. Debbie Abrahams, MP.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. I want to move on to the Get Britain Working White Paper. You'll be aware that over 2 million disabled people who want to work and a disability employment gap of nearly 30%. What are you doing to help more businesses recruit disabled people into work and also to make sure they retain their experienced workers should they become disabled?
Well, firstly, thank you for raising this because I don't think we talk about this enough. The Employment Rights Bill that we're putting in place puts in place extra protection. In the work that we want to do to get people back into work, there are, as you probably know, 2.8 million people or so who are on long-term sick.
Slightly different from people, the point that I'm making, which is about disabled people. So people on long-term sick won't necessarily be included in that particular figure. So on the 2 million, and it's a fairly static figure, what can we do to change the attitudes and the willingness of employers to recruit disabled people?
Well, we should do everything that we can because it's very important that we have a proper ability for people, disabled people, to be at work, to work in the way that they want, and we should support employers and support them to make sure that happens.
Thank you. Moving on then, thinking about the third of disabled people who are living in poverty because of the extra costs that they face. While work may be the route out of poverty for the 2 million that I've just been talking about, how will you ensure that those disabled people who can't work have adequate support and that systemic safeguards are in place so we don't have more horrendous deaths of sick and disabled people reliant on the social security system?
Well, we have to make sure that support is in there, and we will make sure that support is in there. I do think within that group there are quite a number, particularly those on long-term sick, who do want to be back into work, but want to be supported into work because, as you know, it can be quite a daunting thing if you've been on long-term sick to go back into the workplace. And therefore what we've been looking at is schemes, there are some already there as you know, where employers have schemes to support long-term, those who've been on long-term sick back into work, and I'm very, very supportive of that. I've been to see them for myself, to give people the chance to go back to work because sometimes making that step or taking that step is very, very difficult.
That's a very good point, and I absolutely accept that, but there will be disabled people who will not be able to work. We know that over the last 15 years, disabled people have been particularly battered by the reduction in support that they have got. So I know that disabled people are feeling very anxious about what's going to happen, for example, in the spring. There are a cohort of disabled people who will never work, and they are living in absolute poverty. I mean, it is some of the conditions that people are living in when they have extra costs of nearly £1,000 a month. That doesn't seem to be recognised. So if you, when in consultation obviously with the Secretary of State, if you're able to expand on how they will be protected, that will be very, very good news to those people.
Yeah, they must be protected.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prime Minister. My final question today relates to pensioner poverty. 300,000 more pensioners are living in relative poverty since 2013, and women are one of the groups that are disproportionately affected by this. And this has been significantly increased by recent increases in the state pension age. We know that the DWP estimates the restrictions and eligibility for winter fuel payment will also add to the number of disabled pensioners living in poverty. I appreciate increasing pensioner credit is very important, but single pensioners just above that £11,000 threshold can't wait until next spring before they get their uprating in their state pensions. What further mitigations are you considering given the potential impacts on the health and well-being of these pensioners?
There are allowances in place which are not targeted to pensioners in particular, but for households that are struggling, obviously, as you know, administered by local authorities, that we have not only maintained but enhanced, so that is in place. The upgrade or the uptick in the pension that comes in April is about £470. Of course, there was an uptick in the April of this year as well, and therefore a pensioner, as it were, a year ago facing the winter, even with the winter fuel allowance, will not be as well off as a pensioner after the £470 next April. But that is only because we can maintain the triple lock, which we wouldn't be able to maintain if we didn't stabilise the economy, which is why we did what we needed to do with the budget.
My point is specifically about this group who have also, we've seen increases in poverty. They can't wait until spring. If we have a bad winter, they will be affected. And I hope you'll be able to come forward with some mitigations there, Prime Minister. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for now, Ms Abrahams. Helen Hayes, MP.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, along with every other member of this House, you will be aware from your constituents of the extent of the crisis in the support for children and their families who have special educational needs and disabilities. On the 16th of June this year, you were asked by ITV News whether you could make a promise to parents of children with SEND that you will change the way that government deals with local authorities and hold them to account for SEND provision. And you said, yes, I can make that promise. When do you expect that children with SEND and their families will be able to access the support they need without having to go to the tribunal to fight for it?
Well, I mean, firstly, thank you for raising this. This is, I think, the issue that's been raised, Prime Minister's questions with me, more than any other issue from all sides of the House. So the inheritance on SEND is a system that was neglected to the point of complete crisis. What we've therefore done, to come to your question, is allocated more money in the first instance in the budget for special educational needs so that we're able to put better provision in now. But also, alongside that, I think we've got to reform. We've got to have a much earlier intervention system in place, and we need to make sure that this is predominantly mainstream. And they are longer term changes, but my own strong belief is that even with the extra funding, which is desperately needed, if we don't change the way special education is provided, that we'll never be able to plug the gap and fix the problem that you've described. So yes, more money in through the budget, but also early intervention and making sure the provision is available in mainstream schools is the reform and the change that I think we need to bring about and as urgently as possible.
So the money in the budget this year is very, very welcome. I think there was relief across the sector about that. It is the £1 billion that was allocated is just a third of the current in-year deficit for SEND. So it is a helpful amount of money. It is not a transformative amount of money. What local authorities are most concerned about is this question of the statutory override, which, as you all know, is an accounting fudge which allows SEND-related deficits to be kept off their books. It comes to an end in March 2026. Local authorities will be, in just a few weeks' time, setting their budget for the coming financial year. And it seems to them that the DFE, the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and the Treasury are talking to each other about how that will be dealt with, but nobody is talking to local authorities. Can you say when local authorities will have certainty about what happens at the end of the statutory override?
Yeah, the Deputy Prime Minister is talking to local authorities about this. I'll obviously follow up with her as a result of your questions here this afternoon. But that commitment on special educational needs is absolutely clear and has to be joined up within government because it's intolerable. Yes, that extra investment, that extra money needed to put in. I accept that no amount of extra money on its own is going to provide the better provision in my view. It's also got to come with the reforms that we are working on and we've set out. That is joined up within government. I know that the Deputy Prime Minister is all over this. It matters hugely to her. I will just double down and make sure, you now having raised it, that all the relevant conversations are taking place.
And this is an existential issue for local authorities. If there isn't a solution to the statutory override, the government will see an avalanche of local authorities issuing Section 114 notices. So it couldn't be more important. And I do know from what I hear from those working in the SEND sector in local government that local authorities are absolutely anxious to understand what the government's approach to this issue of their debt will be.
No, I know they're anxious about it. It's a huge financial burden on local authorities. It's causing problems all over the country in all sorts of constituencies and with all sorts of authorities, and that's why we've taken the measures that we have. We'll obviously talk to them further, but I'm acutely aware of the Section 114 problem and the pressures that they're under, and that this is a major driver of that particular problem.
I'd like to turn finally, if I may, Prime Minister, to the question of early years education and childcare. So we know that the early years provide a unique opportunity to close the disadvantage gap for the most disadvantaged children, to set them up for an education that so that they can make the most of education for the rest of their lives. The government inherited a childcare strategy from the previous government, the rollout of an expanded hours offer, which is almost exclusively aimed at targeting working families. There is evidence that in doing so, there is a risk that provision will be reduced for the poorest children who stand to benefit the most from high quality early years provision. Are you concerned, Prime Minister, that the government's early years education and childcare strategy is at odds with the work of the Child Poverty Task Force?
Well, the Child Poverty Task Force is obviously doing its work at the moment and will issue its report in the spring of next year, and so we want to bring these things together. I completely accept what you put to me, that what happens in the years 0 to 4 to 5 of a child's life are more impactful than at any other point in that child's life, and therefore we have to put the support in there. Childcare is part of that, but one of the reasons that we set as a milestone in our plan for change, making sure that children arriving in reception were ready to learn, was precisely because those years are so important. At the moment, as you know, children arriving in reception have very varying abilities, some able to get on very quickly and be ready to learn.
I think what Ms Hayes is saying is that without the right solution, that milestone may not be met. Is that what Ms Hayes?
I think there might need to be a change to the delivery of the childcare strategy in order to achieve the government's goal of ensuring that more children are ready to start
I think that's
school.
one strand of it, and we want to push on as far as we can, but everything's got to be done within the fiscal framework that we've got, and therefore we have to balance this across the piece. But I accept the proposition you're putting to me. I know that the milestone is going to be difficult to meet, but just as with housing and waiting lists and living standards, I'm absolutely determined that we're going to meet it, because it's a bit like Sure Start under the last Labour government. It made such a material difference. This is, if you like, our equivalent, which is to make sure that by the time children are arriving at school reception, they are ready to learn in a way that they frankly aren't.
So, Prime Minister, could we just ask that you take away what Ms Hayes has raised and look into that specific technical issue that she's raised particularly?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Yes, good afternoon, Prime Minister. The Public Accounts Committee exists to scrutinise public expenditure across government to get the biggest bang for the taxpayer's pound. One of the ways you could save billions is to improve public sector productivity. I've got 3 discrete questions to ask around that. The first is adoption of new technology. Fairly simple things like improving digital record keeping, investing in legacy computer services. The last government put 3.2 billion into the health service. And the third area in technology is to adopt new technology like AI much quicker than it's doing at the moment.
Yeah.
How are you going to improve that?
Well, we have to improve across the board on AI and technology and delivery. And I think that's in relation to the services that are delivered as the end product, but also the way that we do government. There are, I don't know how many examples of this, but digital record keeping is crucial. In the NHS at the moment, everybody gets the red book when they have a child, but none of it is digital. We have to resubmit all of the information that we give every time we go to a different hospital. We have to change the outlook.
There's lots of examples. So the second area is...
There are lots of examples. I've got the scale. When I arrived in the Crown Prosecution Service, everything was done on paper, every single case. And I said, we need a digital file, because it's ridiculous that we're carting these papers, usually in the back of a van, from court to court. Yep. So the doing bit is the hard bit, which is driving it through government to make sure that we can bring that about. Everybody will agree you need more technology. Very few can deliver it, and it's the delivery bit that I'm focused on.
It needs you as Prime Minister to drive that. The second area is procurement.
Yeah.
A lot of government procurement, particularly large public sector project, is woeful. Just to take AI at the moment, the government is very slow at procuring, and it hasn't begun to adopt AI at the speed it needs to because it's moving so quickly. AI, things like defence, our procurement budget was £16.9 billion overspent. We've had a woeful hearing on HS2 this morning. The experts have no idea how much it's going to cost. Some people think it's going to be double the present estimate of 44 billion. They have no idea when it's going to come into operation. Some people thought it was going to come into operation at 2037. Really, we have to find a way of improving these big public sector improvement projects, because at the moment there's a reputational risk for the UK in doing them.
I couldn't agree more. Whether it's in defence is an example, but it's not the only example of where we absolutely need to improve procurement. There are plenty of other departments where we need to. HS2 is a case study of the last government on how to mishandle a major project. Over budget, over time, cut back, and almost a textbook example of what the last government got wrong when it came to big infrastructure projects. That doesn't mean we should abandon infrastructure projects, but it does mean we've got to do them differently and we've got to do them better, so I couldn't agree with you more.
So, Prime Minister, there's been dither and delay for the last 6 months, not much has happened on HS2. Moving on to the third area where you could save billions in improvement of public sector productivity is in skills. Skills in the civil service. For example, in digital posts, there's 4,000 vacancies. There's vacancies in AI procurement. There's vacancies in project managers. How can we make sure that we get the people in the high-tech skills that we need to do all of this public sector productivity? And if necessary, one of the things that's holding it back is that they say that they have to pay the civil service rate of pay. For some of these very skilled electronic skills, the market is paying way over what the public sector rate of pay are. So how are you going to rectify this?
Well, we've put in place some measures trying to track these skills in. We have had some success getting good people in to work on AI and tech, and we want to improve on that because I think these are going to be a game changer. So we're pushing ahead with that. We're never going to be able to match the private sector. But I do think that we can attract in good people, and I do think there are plenty of people who are technically gifted, have the skills that we need, but also bring what civil servants bring with it, that sense of public service to want to deliver here. So we're having those discussions now because I completely agree with you. We need those skills inside government driving this, because this will change not only the public services we're actually delivering as a government, but the very way in which the government delivers its services as well.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. Emily Thornbury MP.
So whilst all this is going on at home, there are a number of challenges internationally as well, and you have, of course, since being elected, had to spend a great deal of time on the international stage, meeting many people. And I think I probably really must ask you about Syria and then perhaps ask you about Israel and Gaza. So can I begin with Syria?
Yeah.
Who are the main international players, those with power and influence in Syria at the moment?
Well, I mean, Syria is obviously fast-moving, and
Yes.
The speed at which Assad fell was not foreseen by many, but it's a good thing. But we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that what comes next is necessarily going to be different and better, because we've made that mistake before, in my view. We are talking to regional leaders. I was out in the region just last week.
Which regional leaders? Sorry to interrupt.
Well, last week I was UAE and Saudi, but other regional leaders that we've been talking to, but also global leaders, as to how we collectively ensure that what comes next is better. Obviously, that also includes talking to some of those on the ground. I won't go into the details of that, but you'll understand that those conversations need to be had to ensure that, if it's possible, we have a regime that complies with international law, that protects the rights of civilians and minorities, and that this can be a genuine and real
and
turning
women,
point
Prime
for
Minister.
Syria.
And women.
Of course.
And women.
Of course, yeah.
Do you agree with President Trump that that it's all about Turkey in Syria at the moment?
The role of Turkey is clearly important, and have been part of our discussions. But you know, there are this is a fast-moving, complicated situation. So yes. I personally wouldn't say it's all about one thing or another. There are lots
yes.
of moving parts here. But is Turkey an important part of all of this? Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we seem to have in the north, we've got Turkish-backed forces fighting US-backed forces in northern Syria. We've got in southern Syria the Israelis taking chunks out of the south. I mean, how can the United Kingdom ensure that those that do have some power and influence in the region are actually using it to develop a Syrian government that is properly inclusive in the way that you've described?
Well, I think by working with others, with a clear set of principles in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and working in appropriate, necessary ways with the incoming regime, such as it is at the moment. Okay. But that's the approach. But we need to have those principles. What is it we're trying to achieve here? Because I mean, the picture you paint is one that I am concerned about, yes. But it is a very fragmented picture. It could head off into 4 or 5 different sort of areas of conflict or re-conflict, and our job is to try and make sure that that doesn't happen.
Exactly. Can I perhaps, in the time I have, ask you about Israel and Gaza?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, the whole world hopes that we will get a ceasefire in Gaza by the end of the year. The question has to be, I think, that if that does happen, what role will the UK play in what comes next? How will we use our considerable influence in the region and our convening power to make sure that what comes next is a Palestinian nation that comes out of the rubble?
Well, firstly, I completely agree with you. We need this ceasefire, and we need it right now. And obviously, there are intense discussions going on in relation to a Gaza ceasefire, which I hope bear fruit. To then go to your question, the immediate steps, it seems to me, are ensuring the hostages are released, yes. Because they've been held a very, very long time, and they must be released. And a ceasefire is not worthy of its name if it doesn't involve the release of the hostages.
Of course.
Then next, of course, aid needs desperately to go in, both at volume and speed, to a very dire, catastrophic situation in Gaza. And then, as you allude to, we need to create the space through a ceasefire for the necessary steps or progress to a two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel and a viable Palestinian state, neither of which are in place at the moment. We must play, but that may seem rather distant at the moment as we look at it when we haven't even got a ceasefire, but I genuinely believe that it's the only long-term solution to the conflict. There are many steps in between that we are talking through with others, which involve what are the security arrangements in Gaza or other places until we get the progress that we need, who's going to be responsible, how's that going to operate. All of those are questions that I think the UK should be and is involved in, because if we're serious about the two-state solution, we have to answer all the questions from the day a ceasefire starts, and we hope that it does, to the end point at which we want to get to. Have we got answers to the very many questions that arise in the interim? And that's where we're working with others to answer, if you like, the question, well, what happens the day after a ceasefire?
And of course it isn't just, I mean, Palestine won't just be built from the ashes of Gaza.
No.
It also needs to be the West Bank as well. And we know that we are dealing with a government in Israel that, at least its stated view, is that they're not in favour of a two-state solution at the moment. And indeed, of course, some of the wilder members of the Israeli cabinet talk about annexation. Now, if annexation does happen, and we all, of course, hope it doesn't, I'm sure the West will condemn it. But is there a plan B further than condemnation if the West Bank is annexed?
Well, look, I'm very worried about the West Bank, and thank you for raising it, because I think necessarily there's a lot of focus on Gaza and obviously Lebanon recently as well. But the West Bank, there's not only the unlawfulness of the situation on the ground, but also terrible settler violence going on that needs to be dealt with. So the anchor has to be international law and respecting international law, and being clear about what that means in relation to our approach to the West Bank. These are difficult questions, but I strongly believe that we should anchor it in international law, and in relation to the West Bank, the position is therefore clear and settled as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thornbury.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, thank you very much for your dedication to duty and your service to our nation. And in terms of our defence and national security, what is the one thing that keeps you awake at night?
Well, I'm not kept awake by our defence and security. I'm actually assured by our defence and security because we have first-class personnel here and across the world, working with allies. We're playing a leading part in NATO, and part of what I've been trying to do in the last 5 or 6 months is to make sure that we can be clear to the world that the UK is back wanting to play a leading part in the safety and security of across the globe. And wherever I've encountered our service personnel, they're doing a first-rate job, usually in very, very difficult circumstances.
Okay. Well, look, just last week, the Secretary-General of NATO noted that the current security situation is the worst within his lifetime, as he sees it, and that now is the time for members to shift to what he called a wartime mindset. He said that whilst we are not at war, we certainly aren't at peace, given the grey zone attacks and the increasing nature of those. So do you agree with that assessment, and is there an understanding within Whitehall about that threat?
Look, we're living in a more volatile world than we have for many, many years. I think that's absolutely clear. In a number of different places around the world, we have conflict that is escalating, not de-escalating. And we have to match that, and that is why we have doubled down in our support for NATO. It's why we constantly talk to our allies, and always ensuring that we're better prepared. Sometimes that's to do with pure capability, and obviously there's a lot of discussion about exact percentage that's spent on defence. I think it's equally about how we coordinate and collaborate with our partners to best effect, and they're some of the daily discussions that I've been having, including earlier this week where I was in Norway talking about our joint operations in the high north that are vital to our safety and security, and then down in Estonia on the absolute front lines as far as Russia is concerned.
We know about those visits and much needed. in that context, you recently said that Europe needs to do much more when it comes to defence spending, and I certainly agree with that estimation. Russia is spending approximately 7 to 8% of its GDP at the very least. A third of their state budget is going towards defence, and the NATO Secretary General has asked that NATO members should be committing to 3%. The likes of Poland are at above 4%. You've got defence experts and MOD officials reportedly recommending 3.6%. So when are we going to get to 2.5%?
Well, we've made that commitment to 2.5%, and we'll set out a path to that in due course. As you know, there's a strategic review going on. At the moment, I think you've had possibly 2 of the reviewers before your committee,
yes,
and that's due to report in the early part of next year. But we will set that path out to 2.5%.
But the problem, Prime Minister, is that I don't think that we can afford to prevaricate. I mean, there's a huge anomaly here, as I also mentioned to the Secretary of State for Defence. And by the way, I have a huge amount of respect for him, and I believe he gets it. But it's without waiting for a strategic defence review publication, the government has already committed, just this week, billions of pounds to invest in service accommodation, and rightly so. £500 million worth of cuts to different bits of kit, and we're told that we're going to be transitioning to newer platforms. The government has committed to a new military strategic headquarters, recruited a national armaments director, and I could carry on. All of that was without waiting for the publication of the SDR. So why are we just holding back? You know, where's the blocker? Is it Treasury officials that are the blocker?
No. Firstly, on the question of decommissioning kit that's well past its natural life is an obvious and right thing to do. The frigate I was on just earlier this week was in its 33rd year when it was intended to last for 18 years. We shouldn't be proud of that. We need to decommission and move on to better and newer kit and equipment for our service personnel. On your question, as it were, I do think it's important that we have the strategic review, because that is looking, as you know, into the risks and challenges that we face as a country, what our current capability is, and whether we need therefore to make changes to match the risk and challenges to the capability that we have. And therefore what I'm reluctant to do is to commit large sums of money to the budget unless and until we know the outcome of that strategic review, because this money needs to be spent well, and it will only be spent well if it's spent at the end of that exercise.
I've already rattled off a whole load of examples about how the MOD has not waited, and the government has not waited for the publication of the SDR. And certainly autocracies and our international adversaries, they are not going to wait for either economic stability or prosperity. We have to consider, surely, that the cost of peace, that deterring a war is certainly less costly than fighting one. So why are we prevaricating? Why are we not setting out a clear timetable so that our allies know where we stand, our defence community, our industrial base knows exactly where we stand?
Well, firstly, we are spending 2.3% at the moment, as you know. Within that, it's obvious some of that cost is fixed. So if we take the nuclear deterrent, we have a long-term commitment, quite rightly, to the nuclear deterrent. And so within quite a bit of that budget, we know that the money is fixed, it will be there, we will continue with that. Of course, when it comes to decommissioning out of equipment that's well past its sell-by date, it makes sense to do that as quickly as possible. But on the question of the path to 2.5, it is important, in my view, that the review is carried out first, because I want to be assured that we've got an approach which is fit for the risks and challenges that we face. What I want to do is to make a commitment to a strategy that is being revised at the moment by the people who came before your committee. So to my mind, it makes sense to ensure that we are absolutely clear what is the capability we need with a clear sight on the risks and challenges, commit to that, and the pathway then follows, in my view, from that, because that's the way to ensure that the money is well spent and that we get the right value for the investment that we are making and the right capability to face those threats.
Thank you for that clarity. Dame Karen Bradley.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Good afternoon. Children are often the biggest victims of global conflict, and I'm thinking of the 20,000 estimated Ukrainian children who have been stolen by Russia. What are you and your government doing to help locate them and reunite them with their families?
We're working with, it's a tragic and awful situation, and thank you for raising it. We are working with all of our allies on this, but particularly the US, France, Germany, and of course Ukraine as well, because it's a terrible situation, and we're doing everything that we can.
What can you do, though, to locate them and get them back home?
Well, only we can work with our allies to try to achieve that end. It's a difficult situation because of the complexities of the conflict, but that doesn't diminish the need for us to do the necessary work.
Okay, thank you. Turning to Syria, there are a number of former UK nationals who are now stateless in Syria. What is the government's position on those stateless individuals, given what has happened in Syria?
Well, I don't think it's wise for me to comment on individual cases. I think the principle that we have to apply is that our national security comes first. And so that's the way in which we will look at these cases. Each of them will be different, and I won't comment on each of the individual cases, but I do think the principle has to be our national security first, and that will be the primary consideration in the decisions that fall to be taken, if and when they do fall to be taken.
So there'll be a case-by-case basis?
There have to be, yeah.
Okay. But that's not the situation with the temporary pause that's been put on asylum applications for Syrian nationals. So as and when will the government change its position on that? Because clearly, under international law, we cannot just have a blanket stop on asylum applications from Syrian nationals.
No, you're right about that. The reason we put the pause in is because, as you know, many of the applications that are coming through are people fleeing from Assad. And so the situation in that respect has changed. An assessment of the safety of the situation in Syria is very difficult to do at the moment, and we need to work, as I was alluding to earlier, on ensuring that that situation is a successful turning point for Syria. We can't put them on pause forever, I accept that. We will just have to keep it under review. But what's driving it at the moment is the fact that most of these are fleeing from the old regime, but we're not in a position to say with any degree of certainty what might be the situation going forward. I hope it's a situation, I'm sure many of those that are here hope it's a situation where it is safe and secure for them to return home, which is what many of them would love to do.
Thank you. All of this, of course, these conflicts across the whole world leads to more irregular migration. What is the role of safe and legal routes in irregular migration policy?
Well, they can play a really important role. So, to take the examples, after the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, a route was set for Afghanis to come here. And we've got obligations that we are honouring. Another example would be Hong Kong, where there's a well-established route in place, and of course Ukraine. So where they work, and they work well, they do provide that safe route, although I have to say the constant attention is needed to the Afghan scheme, in my view.
But you're talking about specifics, country-specific schemes. In opposition, you voted for more blanket safe and legal routes. Have you changed your view on that?
No, I do think we need safe and legal routes from a particular country, but I also think that we should be taking measures necessary upstream to reduce the likelihood that people feel they have to flee in the first place. And I think it's very important that we do so.
I think we'd all agree with that, but just to be clear, you're not now supportive of just more blanket safe and legal routes? No,
and I've never been supportive of blank safe and legal routes, but I do believe that I believe in the Afghan scheme, I believe in the Hong Kong scheme, I believe in the Ukraine scheme. I think they're good examples of a safe and legal route for people fleeing awful circumstances where we've got an obligation.
I very much welcome the agreements that you've been striking around the world to tackle migration, working with partner countries. There's clearly no silver bullet to dealing with irregular migration. Do you think there needs to be a deterrent?
Yes, and I think that breaking up the gangs that are running the trade, putting people in our particular case in boats across the channel is a very effective deterrent. Equally, I think that being returned swiftly if you get her and you've no right to be here is a very effective deterrent. What I don't think is a deterrent is a gimmick that doesn't work, which is what I thought the Rwanda scheme was.
And how are you communicating that deterrent around the world to those who may consider making these journeys?
Oh, by the action that we're taking. You'll have seen there was a very high-profile arrest just a few weeks ago of a Turkish national who's obviously there'll be proceedings going on, so I'll be careful what I say, but it was a very significant arrest. In relation to the deal that we did with Germany, hugely significant, because as you know, a lot of the boats that are arriving on the north coast of France are coming through Germany. Some of them are in warehouses in Germany, and it personally has been frustrating for me. We couldn't get our hands on them. By striking that agreement with Germany, we now can enhance our law enforcement to disrupt in Germany before anybody gets those boats to the north coast of France. These are effective actions that deter those that are running this trade from the vile trade that they're in, and hugely important. Those boats were simply transiting up to the north coast and nobody was intercepting
But I accept and absolutely take that point, but how are you going to deter the young person who decides that their only hope is to travel, make a very dangerous crossing and try and get to the United Kingdom?
Well, I think first we've got to work upstream in some of the countries of origin on the causes of fleeing, so whether it's conflict, whether it's poverty, whether it's climate, there are things that can be done. Then we need to break the chain that is available on payment of money for people to travel. Those that are running this vile trade are making a huge amount of money exploiting vulnerable people by taking a lot of money off them to put them into boats that are not seaworthy. If they were cars on our road, we wouldn't allow them to be in use, and yet somehow it's thought tolerable that people can even get into these boats. We've got to smash that.
We absolutely have. I don't think any of us think it's tolerable. Don't worry, Prime Minister.
No, but it's, I mean, you know, one of the reasons I have face-to-face meetings with my counterparts in countries like Germany and France and Italy is so that I can have at that level the necessary discussions to say if we can agree at our level that this needs to be done, then there's a better chance of the action further down. And you know, that's the German agreement is an example of that, because that's one of the conversations that I had.
Thank you very much, Dame Karen. Prime Minister, just a couple of quick follow-ups really from what you've answered to colleagues. In response to Dame Karen, you were talking about safe and legal routes, and you mentioned Afghanistan. But we have also horrors around the world, like in Sudan. Do you have a hierarchy of countries where you want to see safe and legal routes, or you know, what's your plan for countries where there are other challenges where people may need to flee?
Well, in Sudan, which is a terrible situation, we obviously have to work with allies. I think the primary objective in Sudan is to get a working ceasefire of some sort, and that's what we're bearing down on with our allies.
Are you working on safe and legal routes in the region?
Well, we're working with our allies, but our primary focus is on getting a ceasefire of the situation.
Okay, so I'm just on the question of safe and legal routes. Do you have a decision-making process within government about which countries you will apply safe and legal routes to?
Well, we talk to our allies about what's possible out of any conflict zone, but whether it's Sudan or anywhere else, the primary objective has to be the cessation of the hostility in the first place.
Okay, well, and also on migration, we've heard from Florence Eshalomi from Dame Caroline and Sir Geoffrey about the challenges of skills in the UK. Because construction, tech and digital and AI have come up today. Are you having any discussions with the Migration Advisory Committee about any shortage occupations that should be on their list? Because if you want to build the 1.5 million homes just to take construction, there will be a real squeeze with cladding and with the need to build those homes to find the skills available in the UK at the moment.
Yes, we are, and what we're doing is making sure that what the Migration Advisory Committee are doing is consistent with what we're doing in our Industrial Strategy Council and consistent with what we're doing with Skills England. In my view, those three have been operating as separate silos for far too long, and I want to bring them together. So
when will we see a list of shortage occupations that the Migration Advisory Committee publishes? When are you expecting that?
Well, that'll be a matter for the committee.
But when are you providing the information into them? I mean, are you willing as Prime Minister to say yes? Sometimes we will need overseas skills to help deliver on the missions that you've set out.
Well, we're always going to need overseas skills. I can't imagine a situation where we don't need a single person into this country for
so you would give a green light, basically, well, the Migration Advisory would have your blessing if it would...
No. I mean, the reason we're putting all three together is to make sure that what the Migration Advisory Committee are saying and advising is consistent with what we can deliver with Skills England, which needs to bear down on the skills we need for growth. And that is consistent with the industrial strategy, which is intended to bring businesses and those involved in growth.
But that will take a while, won't it? My point about asking about the Migration Advisory Committee is you need skills now to get to that target of 1.5.
Sure, but that conversation needs to take place.
Okay.
Obviously, what I don't want to do is to choke off businesses that are thriving at the moment by cutting their legs off and saying you can't have inward migration. But it needs to be part of a rolling programme so that we wean ourselves. We've got very high levels of net migration in this country. It's quadrupled since we left the EU, completely out of control under the last government. And part of that is a complete lack of coordination and strategy to have the skills we need in this country. So those discussions need to take place. In the meantime, I'm not going to chop the legs off our businesses.
I'm sure they'll be pleased to hear that.
Make it hard for them to get the skills they need.
And then in response to Ms Abrahams and her questions about disabled people, Ms Abrahams, you wanted to come back in on that point about specifics.
Prime Minister, I don't know if you're able to add to the response you gave me in terms of, for example, how specifically we're going to be engaging with employers to ensure that the 2 million disabled people who are able to work can be supported into it.
You said we should do everything we can, which is great, but specifics would be helpful.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll do a follow-up letter with a lot of detail in it.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And then finally, Prime Minister, you've been in the hot seat for 5 months now. You had the campaign, the general election, the euphoria of walking down Downing Street on that first day. But reflecting on your experience in the last 5 months, what would you have done differently, knowing what you know now?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say that having been 9 years in politics, all bar the last 5 months in opposition, it is far better to be in a position of power to change lives for the better than it ever is in opposition. I came into politics late in life, having had a legal career, in order to change lives for the better. I then sat in opposition for 9 years, going around the division lobbies, losing the vote every night. Now we can get on with delivering, and I'm very pleased that.
Is there any lessons you've learned, though, having been in Number 10, seen the machinery of Whitehall, had your levers on the hands of power? Anything you would do differently if you would give your former self, your 5 months ago self, some advice? What would that be?
Well, look, I mean, I knew it'd be tough. I knew the inheritance was going to be pretty awful. It's worse than I thought in every respect. There was £22 billion missing from the economy. The prisons were so overfull that when we had the disorder in the summer, I had to have I had to have the figures up in the corner of the room, in the Cobra room, as to how many prison places we had in every prison around the country, because we're at a bursting point when we were trying to arrest people on the streets.
We all know that because you've said that before. I'm just being. But is there anything that you would do differently if you were starting out now, knowing what you know?
No, we had to do tough stuff. We're getting on with it, and I'm very pleased to be delivering from a position of power rather than going around the division lobbies losing every night. I've had too much of that.
Well, thank you very much, and can I thank you very much, as I say, for being so proactive in coming in front of us showing a commitment to transparency and scrutiny. And I wish you and your family a merry and peaceful Christmas. We do hope you're getting a break at some point, though I suppose with your international hat on, you're probably going to be continually busy over the Christmas period. But thank you very much indeed for your time.
Well, let me thank the committee and wish you all a happy Christmas and a peaceful New Year, uninterrupted, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Order.